Joe Burrow, the number one pick of the Cincinnati Bengals, on arguably the hardest team to project in fantasy because we don't know what Joe Burrow's going to do. Could he go out there and put up one of the better rookie seasons and make a lot of fantasy viable options? He definitely can. We look at Daniel Jones last year. Everyone was, oh, Daniel Jones is so bad. He can't do anything. He's going to be a complete bust. And he came in there and was very, very good for fantasy. Not only for himself down the line, but he made wide receivers in Golden Tate, Darius Slayton, tight end Caden Smith started to play well. Evan Ingram had a good start. He supported multiple fantasy players in that offense with a bad offensive line. Joe Burrow is going to be playing on a bad offensive line with a lot of weapons similar to Daniel Jones. And I think he can make a lot of viable fantasy options for this upcoming season similar to Daniel Jones last year. Currently, I have Joe Burrow projected for 3,800 yards and 28 passing touchdowns with 12 interceptions. Around QB 20, but I think he is worth a late round flyer, mainly because he has a lot of upside, and his floor is really low, but when you're drafting him so late, it's fine to have a low floor because you can cut him and stream other guys. The QB class this year is very deep. Guys like Daniel Jones, Jared Goff, Ben Roethlisberger, even Kirk Cousins are around to be streamed on a weekly basis. But I think Joe Burrow offers elite upside, so he's definitely worth a late round flyer if you're trying to find this year's Lamar Jackson. But before we get into the plethora of Cincinnati Bengals wide receivers, let's break down the reliable aspect, which is the run game, in Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon's played with a terrible offensive line on a bad offense for numerous years now, and he's done pretty well, being a consistent top 15 running back throughout his career in fantasy, and I expect that to continue. The offensive line is still bad. The coming back of Jonah Williams is definitely going to help, but they're starting Bobby Hart at the other tackle position, who is a atrocious right tackle. Their offensive line is still bad. Mixon's yards per carry somehow survived that, but I don't expect a breakout from Mixon because I don't think top 5 running backs can come on bad offensive lines unless your name is Saquon Barkley or Christian McCaffrey. But I have Mixon for a RB12 finish, which is around his ADP. I have him for 1,134 yards on the ground and 6 touchdowns, and 40 receptions for 300 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. So around 1,400 scrimmage yards and 8 touchdowns for Mixon, which is right around what he's been putting up. I expect the Bengals offense to be similar to what it was last year in yardage. Dalton actually threw for 3,500 yards in 13 games, which is a lot. So I expect Mixon's stat line to be pretty similar to last season. He should have some more consistency because last year he started out the year atrocious and finished the year with 3 of 4 games being over 130 yards on the ground. So Mixon should have a more consistent year, so don't panic and think that'll start slow again because Burrow was a rookie. If anything, I think he'll start hot because teams don't know what to scheme for. But other than Mixon, Giovanni Bernard has kind of fallen off. He's not even worth the draft pick anymore. Maybe he's a handcuff. But I think if Mixon were to go down, they would bring in a veteran to complement Giovanni Bernard. So I don't even think he's worth a draft pick unless you are banking on a Mixon injury. But let's move to the wide receivers. And arguably the deepest wide receiver room in the NFL with the likes of A.J. Green, Tyler Boyd, T. Higgins, John Ross, Auden Tate, and Alex Erickson. But let's start with A.J. Green. And this is a guy who, when he's on the field, is a dominant wide receiver 1 in the NFL. But he missed all of last year, and I think he is the player that half the league will not be drafting because they've been burned by him so many times. And his ADP has taken a toll on that. But I'm also one of those players who will just not draft A.J. Green because I just can't. But if you're going to draft A.J. Green, I think you'll get 7 to 10 games out of him this year. And on a per-game basis, he will be really, really good. The thing is, though, I'm not willing to draft a guy who's going to be out at the end of the year with a 7th or 8th round pick because I just don't want to do that. If he plays a full 16, which is not going to happen and be an anomaly for his career, you can expect top 15 to 20 wide receiver numbers. So if you're trying to win your league and trying to take a home run in every pick, I mean, AJ Green is definitely your guy. But I don't expect that to happen. I expect him to play 9 games, but his per game stats should be really good. Through 9 games, I have him for 55 receptions for 750 and 7, which will probably have him around a top 15 wide receiver during those 9 games. But I just can't project him to play more than that. I mean, his per 16 games will not be 1,500 yards. But AJ Green's a guy who I think is going to be motivated to come back, play really well, and ultimately just get hurt. I think, well, that stat line would have him as wide receiver 37 for the year. But when he's on the field, he is a guy you're going to have in your lineup every single week and should be a good option. It's just that I don't want to draft a guy who I think is going to get hurt. Which is sad to say, but I just don't want a guy who will not be there come fantasy playoff time because there is no way he is healthy through 13, 14 games this year. But his counterpart, Tyler Boyd, is basically Mr. Consistency. Not a high ceiling type of guy, but a very, very high floor. And I expect Boyd to do basically exactly what he did last year. Last year he finished as the wide receiver 23. This year I have him finishing as the wide receiver 25 on 75 receptions for 870 and 7 touchdowns. And I think Boyd is the one guy who's going to be Mr. Consistent throughout this fantasy wide receiver room because AJ Green showed that he is an injury-prone player throughout his career. John Ross has shown he's been an injury-prone player throughout his career. And T. Higgins is a rookie wide receiver. I think Boyd is the only guy who starts for 16 games, and I think he'll be putting up a very modest 12 points a game in fantasy on a stat line of like 4 or 5 receptions for 50 yards and maybe a touchdown every other week. He is a fine flex play if you're just trying to get a consistent option. As a wide receiver too, he doesn't have that upside I'm really looking for because there are so many wide receivers, and especially if AJ Green and John Ross don't get injured, which I think they will because history says they will, then you're looking at a guy who's not going to be seeing nearly as many targets as he had last year. No matter how bad the quality of targets was, last year Tyler Boyd received 148 targets and finished as a low-end wide receiver 2. This year, he'll be around 100 to 110 targets. And he has to be better with those targets because they'll be better targets, but I just think Boyd's upside is very limited because last year he had the opportunity, even with a terrible QB, and just didn't take it, which shows he's not that elite wide receiver who can be good with shitty targets. It's just a consistent wide receiver option. It's a very safe pick, similar to Tyler Lockett. You know what you're getting, and it's in fine price for his current ADP. But as a wide receiver too, I wouldn't want him. As a flex, I'm okay with it. Now, a guy who really throws a wrench into the equation is T. Higgins. We have no idea how much he's going to be playing this year, but the Cincinnati Bengals spent the first pick of the second round on him, so I expect him to get a lot of playing time because you don't invest high draft capital for a player who's going to be sitting out the entire year. Zach Taylor is going to be coaching to win this year, and if T. Higgins is the best wide receiver out there, he will be playing over AJ Green and Tyler Boyd if he's better than them. He is a big-bodied receiver and looks like the second coming of AJ Green, and I currently have him statted out for 50 receptions for 550 and 4, and it's hard to project a rookie wide receiver when you don't know how he will perform in the league, but when the guys like Alex Erickson can put up 500 yards and Auden Tate can put up 500 yards, I have confidence that T. Higgins will take 500 yards out of the equation. Not worth drafting, though. Could be sneaky good towards the end of the year when guys like John Ross and AJ Green are out of the equation, likely. And speaking of John Ross, another guy who played well last year in the beginning of the season, but just got injured. He is a sneaky sleeper because if he plays a full 16, I could see a 1,000-yard season for him. And it'll be a very inconsistent 1,000 yards because he's a big play type of guy. He's like a Deshaun Jackson fantasy option. you'll have him on your bench when he scores 35 points, and you'll have him in your lineup when he scores 2. But I think John Ross, per game, similar to AJ Green, will be very good. Burrow will support some fantasy options that are going to be good, like Daniel Jones did last year. For example, Darius Slayton wasn't good the entire season. Golden Tate wasn't good for the entire season. Sterling Shepard wasn't good for the entire season. But they were good for stretches. The Giants last year and the Bengals this year are a very comparable team because there's 3 or 4 wide receivers which are pretty good on the team, and they're all injury prone. Other than the one which is Slayton compared to Boyd, because they're consistent. They didn't get injured in college. They didn't get injured in the NFL. But the rest, they got injured throughout the year. But when Shepard and Tate were playing, they were strong options. Which is why I'm saying you're going to be drafting these Bengals wide receivers, and they're not going to be good for the whole year. Golden Tate had a 3 or 4 or 5 game stretch where he was very good. But for majority of the year, he wasn't that good. I think same thing for Cincinnati this year. Joe Burrow will be pretty decent fantasy QB, a low tier QB1, and a viable streaming option with a good matchup. But the Bengals wide receivers will all have good stretches throughout the year and will all be viable fantasy options. So if you're in a deeper league with a deeper bench, guys like John Ross and AJ Green are worth that early round pick. I mean, not worth the early round pick. They're worth playing in the beginning of the year when their per game stats are good. But lastly, we have the tight end position, and I expect nothing really here from CJ Uzomah. I have him for 450 and 4, tight end 18. Wouldn't worth drafting. Not much to talk about. Just not a talented player. But overall, I would like to see the Bengals offensive line play a bit better. I'd have a lot more confidence in them as a team, but the crowded wide receiver room really brings down the potential and upside of some guys like AJ Green, John Ross, Tyler Boyd, because there's not enough targets to go around. It's going to be a very spread out room, and I think if anyone's the one to break out, it's Joe Burrow, not one of these wide receivers. And Joe Burrow is probably the guy that I'd be taking a late round flyer on. Joe Mixon is definitely a strong fantasy option. I think he'll finish as an RB1. Currently have him statted out as the RB12 for the season coming up. And yeah, I think just the Bengals are going to be a pretty good fantasy option for this season. Make sure to, as always, like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below. What do you think of Joe Burrow? Is he going to be a bust? Am I projecting way too much with 28 passing touchdowns this season? And check out our Instagram at gridiron_guys_YT to see more fantasy content to help you win your league.